Let's cover also nuclear option of the Russian side. If there is a European peacekeeping mission, European deterrent force in Ukraine, what are the chances of Russia using nuclear weapons against European troops?
Well, that is a very good question. I think it's, overall, I think it is highly unlikely. Firstly, I say that because both Britain and France have a nuclear deterrent, although it is much, much smaller than the Russians. The combined nuclear weapons of Britain and France are enough to annihilate Russia anyway, and Putin will know that. There is some discussion that the Russians might try and use tactical nuclear weapons. These are smaller ones to take out particular armoured formations and others. Again, I think this is highly unlikely. The French do have some tactical nuclear weapons, so could respond. But I think, as we've discussed on your programme before, the launching of any tactical nuclear weapons, I think a coalition NATO peace enforcement force would have the capability with the weapons like Storm Shadow to prevent them being launched. So I personally think the nuclear issue, as we've discussed many times before over the last 3 years, is a non-issue, because Putin knows that the moment he flexes his nuclear weapons, that is the end of it. And that is not what we understand he wants to achieve. So, yeah, I think that the chance of a nuclear exchange is very remote.
But don't you think that Russia could try to challenge, to test the readiness of European troops by conducting, for example, false flag operations or small incursions? What is your take on that?
Yes, I think that's very likely, and I am sure that the coalition troops will be contingency planning for that. And if there is any slight incursion, it's very important that the coalition force hits it very hard. When it comes to false flag, that is more difficult, of course, but that is where intelligence is key. Of course, we rely very heavily on US intelligence to provide a clear picture. And one would, that it is pretty essential that intelligence still goes on. Although, having said that, among the UK and France and the other NATO European countries, they still have a very considerable intelligence gathering capability. But the key thing is, if there is any transgression of the ceasefire rules, then it is hit very hard indeed.
And also, do you expect European troops, European air assets, and, for example, if this is a case, American air assets to help Ukraine to close a sky over Ukraine, to help Ukraine to deter and also to intercept Russia's missiles in case of a large missile attack on Ukraine?
Well, I think there are two elements to this. If there is a ceasefire in place, yes, absolutely, coalition air assets would take out any incursions into Ukraine by Russian missiles or drones or jets. As far as Western assets supporting Ukraine, if there is no ceasefire, then that is something that we must consider, because if there is no ceasefire and the fighting continues, I expect particularly the European NATO coalition must reevaluate how they support Ukraine. What is very clear in the West, in Europe, is that we cannot afford, we will not allow Russia to take Ukraine completely. So there is a scenario, and it's a worst case scenario, where British and French troops might have to be on the ground to support Ukraine against Russia, and fighter jets in the air. I would add that that is worst case scenario, but if there is a ceasefire in place, absolutely coalition air power would take out any missiles fired at Ukraine.
But would coalition forces have enough air defense systems to protect, for example, its own troops on the ground in Ukraine? Because Prime Minister Keir Starmer is also trying to convince Trump to provide European allies with additional air defense assets. What is your opinion on that?
Well, we're getting in some sort of quite technical detail, and I being a soldier, I'd never sort of profess to completely understand the air environment, as it were. It is a very good point that you make, but I am sure that the British and French and the European coalition would not want to deploy troops into a ceasefire line without the right air defense cover. It's a technical issue. I intuitively think that with all the air assets that are available in Europe, it is possible. But of course, it would be far easier with the Americans providing the backstop and the support to cover the air. But if that's not the case, then Europe is going to have to do the best it can.
And what could happen if Russia, for example, attacks Ukraine not from the Russian territory, but, for example, from a territory of Belarus? How should European allies respond?
Well, I think it's the same deal with the ceasefire. The rules of engagement will be very clear. And I'm sure they will say any incursion into Ukraine by the Russians will be dealt with severely by a European force, whether that's across the contact line between Ukraine and Russian forces, or whether it's through a second country like Belarus.
Also, let's cover the topic on the war in Ukraine on the ground. Russia's offensive on the east of Ukraine has been slowed down by the Ukrainian army. Ukraine tries to stabilize the front lines. Do you feel that this development can force Russia to seek peace in the nearest future, to agree with ceasefire proposal, because their offensive operations have been slowed down?
Well, certainly it would appear across the front at the moment things are pretty quiet. And people should not forget, of course, that Ukraine holds an area of Russia as well in Kursk, where their operations have failed and stalled. So it gives some advantage to Ukraine. I personally think that in what we call in military terms, the Russian army has culminated. In simple words, it means that it's run out of steam, run out of power. It really can't go much further. So I think any negotiations that happen between Ukraine and Russia, then that needs to be made very clear, because there is obviously some detailed negotiations over land to consider. The Russians have taken 4 oblasts and, of course, the Crimea. And at the moment, Ukraine holds an area in Kursk. So there will be negotiations on what the ceasefire line looks like. But I think the world needs to understand that certainly my personal view is that the Russian army is pretty much spent at the moment and would be pushed to really make much more gains if the war carried on and the West did nothing to support Ukraine.
Thank you, Colonel Hamish, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much for having me. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Thank you very much. Ryan McBeth is U.S. Army veteran and OSINT Analyst. Welcome to our program, Ryan.
Thank you so much for having me on again.
U.S. President Donald Trump is ordering to halt shipment of military aid to Ukraine. Does this mean that the United States is siding with Russia against Ukraine in this war?
I wouldn't necessarily say that the United States is siding with Russia. I am not entirely sure what the president's strategy is here, unless it is just to end the war on any way possible, whether it's on terms that are favorable to Ukraine or not, or perhaps just on terms that would allow the United States to redevelop a relationship with Russia and trade with Russia again. So that kind of might be the method behind the madness there. I'm not saying it's right, but it might be what the president is thinking.
How harmful would be this decision for the U.S. defense industry?
It would be pretty bad. One of the things that is reliable about the United States is that we make very good weapons and we're willing to sell them to pretty much anybody. And the second we've proven ourselves as a poor supplier of weapons, then the world might go someplace else to get something that is perhaps 80% of the effectiveness of the United States weapon system for less cost. I could easily see the deal with India for our F-35s being scuttled under this because India might be reluctant to purchase a weapon system that could be turned off by the United States on a whim. I can also see other countries looking to Europe for weapon systems. When you take a look at the HIMARS system, which was developed by the United States but used in Ukraine, this is a very effective weapon system. But who's to say a country can't go to Israel to get something that is fairly similar for less money, especially if the United States proves to be a less than reliable partner when it comes to actually fulfilling the contracts for those weapons.
What is your personal take on that, what has happened in the White House between President Trump, J.D. Vance, and President Zelensky?
That was a very unique encounter. I never thought I would see the day when you would have a president intentionally bully somebody in front of the camera for what he called good television. Again, I am searching for a reason why the president would do that, and I'm coming up blank. It is my hope that there is some sort of strategic reason that he did that, but unfortunately, I cannot think of that reason.
Do you feel that this conversation could be staged before this visit?
You would think that. I'm not entirely sure why this conversation happened out in the open, unless this was supposed to be some effort at transparency. However, there are some things that you might want to say privately behind closed doors, and then you have the whole conference where everybody reads their scripted remarks. That is how I have seen pretty much every other White House meeting. I'm not sure why this one was different.
Also, the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, and Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, are ready to deploy troops to Ukraine, up to 30,000 European soldiers, and to send fighter jets to Ukraine to enforce a ceasefire deal. However, they're trying to get the US support for this mission, at least American jets in the air patrolling this demilitarized zone. What is your take on this idea? And do you believe, can you imagine a scenario in which Trump supports this mission, at least by providing air cover for European troops?
I'm not entirely sure if the president would support this mission in his current state of mind. But this is a mission that both France and the United Kingdom can perform by themselves. They have the troops, they have the equipment, they have the ability, they have the airborne tanker assets and airborne early warning radar assets that can perform this mission. So this is something that France and the UK can perform on their own without America's help.
Also, during our previous interview, you said that Russia would collapse and Vladimir Putin is not ready to end this war. Do you feel that Donald Trump is ready to face this reality that Vladimir Putin doesn't want this war to be settled?
I'm not entirely sure. And I say that because if the United States agrees to sanction relief as part of the deal with Russia and Ukraine, then Russia is in for a softer landing. And the idea of people rebelling against Putin for putting them out of work, that kind of becomes a lower possibility. So I believe that the president might know that if the war stops tomorrow, Russia might fall apart. But if we pursue sanction relief, then Russia won't fall apart, and the deal might be good for America as well because we can sell our goods to Russia again. That might be the direction the president is heading in, which would be a favorable outcome to Russia.
And do you believe that reducing pressure on Russia would also force Putin, would only convince him to seek a peaceful settlement of the war?
I can't see how forcing or putting less pressure on an adversary would cause them to come to the table. Usually you put more pressure on them until they agree that the pressure is too much. So I'm not quite sure what the tactic is here.
On the other hand, we have J.D. Vance, U.S. Vice President, and during his latest interview, it seems like he is pretty confident in this uncertain strategy of Donald Trump. Moreover, he said that best way to prevent another Russia's invasion is to give Americans economic upside in the future of Ukraine. Also, he's saying that it's a better idea than deploying 20,000 troops from some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years. What is your reaction to this statement?
Well, I believe J.D. Vance may have forgotten the fact that both France and the UK fought in Afghanistan. The UK also fought in Iraq. So I believe that J.D. Vance, he might not be familiar with that. He didn't attain a very high rank in the military, and I don't believe he went to the kind of schools where you were taught that sort of thing.
Also, I would like to cover with you another interesting statements and Trump's national security advisor, Mike Waltz, and U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson are calling probably for a regime change in Ukraine. They said that President Zelensky should resign or seek peace in negotiations with Donald Trump. Have you expected such a U-turn in U.S. foreign policy? Because this is the same objective that has Vladimir Putin to decapitate Ukrainian government.
You know, Ukraine is a pretty resilient country. I'm sure President Zelensky could resign and someone else could take over. And the people could still fight if President Zelensky is the one thing in between receiving aid and not receiving aid. He may understand what he has to do. Even Winston Churchill recognized the writing on the wall toward the end. I can't make that decision. I don't know whether that would necessarily be a good decision or a bad decision. That's something only the president can understand. Sometimes doing the right thing is hard, and people aren't grateful for the things that you've done, and that's just life.
How do you see the things move forward tomorrow in the future? Is there a chance for a reset in the relations between Trump and President Zelensky?
I think that's always possible, and this could certainly be some sort of negotiation tactic that I am just not able to understand. I am a military guy. I am a weapons guy. I can tell you that when it comes to politics and negotiation, my way of negotiating is you shoot the bad guys until they decide to negotiate. That's how I negotiate. So President Trump's strategy is somewhat foreign to me and just not really something I'm able to fully articulate.
And also, it seems like J.D. Vance does not understand President Biden's strategy on Ukraine to support Ukraine as long as it takes, as you just mentioned, to shoot the bad guy until he surrenders and make some concessions to you. From your perspective, why is there such a misunderstanding, and why don't they understand this strategy to put more pressure on Putin? Because after the first day of President Trump in the White House, there were some signs that he could put more pressure on Putin. He threatened sanctions against Vladimir Putin. He threatened tariffs. Why did he change his mind?
I don't know. And the funny thing about this is that it could just be as simple as in the United States, our political environment is very contentious. And so if the Democrats were for one thing, then you must need to be against it. And it could just simply come down to that. We could have a vice president who isn't very well educated when it comes to global affairs or even military affairs. And he just doesn't seem to understand the consequences of his actions. But if the former President Biden was for something, then he knows that it's good politics to be against it. And it could just be as simple as that.
And do you feel that there is a chance that Donald Trump can change his mind again and begin to understand that Vladimir Putin is the biggest obstacle for a peaceful settlement?
The president could change his mind 3 times in one day. So that is always a possibility.
And don't you think there are some discussions in Ukraine and around the globe that the reason is why Donald Trump is putting pressure on Ukraine, but not on Russia, because early stages of negotiations between US and Russia have failed because they didn't have any kind of success in that. That's why they try to put pressure on Ukraine instead. What is your take on that?
No, I think that President Trump just wants the war ended. And he doesn't particularly care who wins or loses, or at least in this case, who loses and who loses more. Because both Russia and Ukraine have lost this war. Now it's only a question of who loses more and who loses less. And I don't think President Trump particularly cares who loses more and who loses less. He just wants it done because he promised he'd get it done. And it's just easier to pick on Ukraine, who needs weapons that the United States has leverage over, than it is to pick on Russia, where the United States has less leverage, especially since we've already established sanctions and there isn't much else we can do.
From your perspective, don't you think that Trump can also change his mind and his attitude when he will see that Ukraine will be in resistance to him, will resist and will continue to fight back against Russia despite the halting of US military shipment?
In my analysis over the past 3 years, one of the things I've noticed is that the people of Ukraine are a lot like the Kurds. These are people who are fighting knowing that maybe their children or maybe even their grandchildren will never be free from the threat of Russia, but they're fighting anyway. And just like the Kurds, America betrayed them. And I don't see Ukraine ever giving up their fight for freedom.
But do you feel that Trump's team would be able to understand this in the future, maybe?
Signs appear that currently Trump's administration does not seem to grasp the geopolitical consequences of their decisions.
And do you feel that they have a plan B for this?
I do not believe that the president has a plan B. I believe he's resting on plan A, which is to stab Ukraine in the back until Ukraine decides that it's easier to give in than continue fighting.
Also, I would like to cover with you US weaponry. From your perspective, how can Ukraine survive without the shipment of HIMARS systems, missiles for ATACMS systems, and also without missiles for anti-aircraft system? What is your take on that?
It makes things a lot tougher. Ukraine might be able to get Patriot systems, or at least Patriot missiles from Israel. It depends on the agreement Israel had with the United States about resale. Once the Patriots run out, which will probably happen by mid-spring or early summer, that's going to be an issue, and Europe needs to step up with either NASAMS missiles or something else in their inventory. It would be great if Israel could recognize that Ukraine is suffering. Israel already had to deal with their own issues when it came to theater ballistic missiles and incoming air threats. It would be nice if Israel could step up because a lot of their arms programs are very advanced. They know how to intercept missiles. So Israel might be able to get some weapons from other countries, specifically Israel. South Korea might be another. They won't be able to get HIMARS systems exactly, but Israel has a similar system that could probably be used, or Ukraine just needs to kind of invent their own system in the next 6 months. And considering that Ukraine has already developed some pretty darn advanced drone systems, that doesn't necessarily seem out of reach, although there are a finite number of research and development projects you can work on at one time. You just have a finite number of engineers and scientists.
From your perspective, can European allies provide Ukraine with missiles for Patriot systems without the permission from the United States, or with a restriction if Donald Trump says you cannot provide Ukraine with Patriot missiles because I think so, this is my decision?
That's a very good question, and that is one of the reasons why some countries like England and France they had to negotiate with the United States for Ukraine to fire Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles directly into Russia. That was because there were some components inside the Scalp and Storm Shadow missiles which were made in the United States. So it depends on the agreement that the United States has with that foreign nation when the arms sale occurred. If the United States allows that country to sell weapons to a third party after a certain term on the contract, then yes, they can give those weapons to Ukraine. But if there's a clause in there that says the United States must agree to the sale, then it might be a lot tougher. And countries like the UK may have to look toward other options. Maybe even look to Spain for some of the older Hawk missiles if those still are under contract.
And how can Ukraine, for example, how can European allies help Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia without ATACMS missiles? What are the alternatives? You just mentioned about the Storm Shadow missiles, but what are the other options from European allies, and how can they help Ukraine with HIMARS systems?
Well, they're not going to be able to help the Ukraine with HIMARS systems unless getting some sort of license from the United States. However, they could develop their own systems. You know, when I said that Ukraine, they could develop their own HIMARS system, they're only limited by scientists and engineers. Nothing is to say that the UK or France can undergo some sort of program where they develop a cheaper version that is similar to the HIMARS in their own country, which they manufacture and then either sell, give, or lease to Ukraine. That is a possibility, but they need to get to work on that right now, so that way Ukraine has these weapon systems. Look, at the end of the day, weapon systems like ATACMS, it's really just a ballistic missile with some guidance. This isn't rocket science. Well, it is rocket science, but it's not. These are all problems that have been solved, and they can solve this problem. They just need to get to work on it immediately.
So you're confident that Europe can replace American aid for Ukraine?
I don't believe that Europe has a choice. Right now, Europe is looking at America, and they know that if they do something America doesn't like, America might cut off access to weapons systems. That doesn't help with the F-35. That's already in the bag. They already purchased that. They have to keep continuing purchasing parts for that. But there is a reason why the French weapons manufacturer, Rafael, why their stock went up 20% a couple of days ago. It's because Europe has just realized that America is not a reliable partner when it comes to selling weapon systems.
Also, I would like to cover with you artillery shells. Ukraine is using artillery on a large scale on the battlefield. Yeah. However, Ukraine is using American-made artillery and American-made shells. how can Ukraine solve this issue with shells for artillery systems, and can Europe replace US producing these shells? How can they solve this issue?
Well, Europe produces 155 millimeter shells. Ukraine might also be able to get them from Israel. They might be able to get them from South Korea. Europe has the capacity, but literally everything rolling off the production line will go to Ukraine. There will be very little left for European militaries, which means that Europe needs to stand up some factories, and they need to do it immediately.
And do you also expect Trump's administration to halt intelligence sharing with Ukraine? Because according to the latest news, also Ukraine receives support from the US intel community regarding the air alerts, regarding the providing information for people about the Russia's attack using ballistic missiles and other air assets. What is your take on that?
Yes, that is certainly possible. The United States either will do that if they haven't already, just as another way to make life harder for Ukraine in order to get them to bend the knee to Russia. I believe that France and the UK might be able to take over some of that role, although they have fewer satellites, and so their coverage of what's going on may be significantly degraded. However, if France or the United Kingdom are able to get early warning aircraft in the air, that will actually be better than periodic satellite footage.
Thank you, Ryan, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you so much for inviting me.